Hi, it's Monday. That means a special edition of the Zogby Report, real and unscripted as always. I'm here as always with my son and managing partner, Jeremy. How you doing today?
Hey, Dad.
So you know what? I thought we kicked up some interest on the Kamala Harris conversation last week. And so there were still some unanswered questions and unanswered and unquestioned thoughts that I had. And so I thought I would continue along those lines this week. And then I do want to talk about cluster bombs to Ukraine afterward. But first, let's continue with Kamala. The nice thing about being a pollster, we deal with data, but the data is meaningless unless we can riff as well. And so this comes under the category of riffing. To repeat, she is less popular than President Biden, less popular actually than any of the major candidates, including Trump and DeSantis and Biden himself. And so we had raised the issue that there may be signals about what Biden will do when we see what he and she will do. Can she continue on the ticket? If he's running full speed ahead, he's got to keep her, obviously, because major admission of a mistake, which no one can afford to make. But if she gets appointed to something, this is all repetitive from last week, then maybe that's a signal of what may be happening. This is of something else happening. So this is what I've come up with as a potential scenario that Diane Feinstein, of course, has announced that she is not running for re-election. That's 2024. However, she also has announced that she's continuing on her term through the year and then not running for re-election. And so there is not only a strong push for her to resign her seat because she is quite frail. I'm not going to get into mental acuity, but she is quite frail and she's missing quite a few votes, including key votes on judicial appointments. There are three candidates already declared and running for her seat. Katie Porter, all three are Congress members. Katie Porter, who is a progressive, Barbara Lee, who is also a progressive, and Adam Schiff, well known from leading to impeachment efforts, who is an establishment moderate Democrat, at least in our context these days. Schiff leads in the polls, but not by much. What's happening is you've got three candidates basically in the teens and low 20s right now, meaning there's a huge undecided at this point in time for 2024 seat. So I wonder if Senator Feinstein would be willing to resign her seat. That would be an option for President Biden to name Vice President Harris to fill the remainder of that seat. What are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, advantages, Kamala Harris won that seat, a seat to the U.S. Senate already. She was elected twice with big votes as Attorney General, so she does well has done well in California. The advantage is it frees up the nomination of a new vice president for the Democrats that takes away that edge that allows Biden to either run again and not have to worry that running with a lightning rod, someone capable of light. Now the disadvantages. For starters, you get three really pissed off Congress people who are already raising, spending, and running for Diane Feinstein's seat. That mixes things up in California and the party that is tantamount to potential earthquake. And secondly, in terms of disadvantages, Kamala Harris is not as popular in California, according to recent, as she used to be. And there are significant numbers of Californians don't want her to run for re-election as vice president. Obviously, no test yet as to whether they want her to run for Senate, but it mixes things up, but it provides an option. The other option, real quick, because it's less of an option, is that Gavin Newsom jumps in to the race and Kamala Harris runs for governor, which would be 2 years into the future, or to fill in a special election. But it's another statewide, and the Senate and governorship, not really a step down that much from vice president. It is California, after all. What do you think? Is that an active mind who just spoke?
Yeah. I can't offer any alternative scenarios. I think that's I think it's interesting. I think it makes a lot of sense. I think at the end of the day, it's very clear that it's becoming, let's put it this way, more and more clear that Biden probably can't run. I do have to say, because who else is going to remind folks that, and look, a lot of people have been saying this for a while, but I was saying this exactly a year ago on this podcast, when last July, the New York Times came out in 1 week with 2 articles, big headlines questioning the age of Biden. And to me, it was clear that was the beginning. And since that long year, it has rapidly intensified. So how the chess pieces exactly move, now we're getting into 4-dimensional chess, trying to think 10 to 15 steps ahead. I'm not sure, but I think your grand thesis or hypothesis is pretty spot on. I think it's accurate.
So, as you know, and I've stated, by and large, I've been a fan of Joe Biden, and I think that he will be viewed in history very, very well for his accomplishments and for defeating Donald Trump, which in itself will be viewed as a positive. I do not subscribe to the serious damage to mental acuity. There is no real evidence. Yes, he has slowed down, but I will not buy that argument against his or suggesting he's been incapacitated. But I'll tell you what has come up that is very troubling to me. One is personal, and the other is political. On the political side, the sending of cluster bombs to Ukraine, I think, is one of the most awful things that I have read since this war has begun. I'm not saying you fight evil with virtue necessarily, but cluster bombs have been outlawed by over 100 countries. There are several in NATO, including the UK, that will absolutely refuse to be part of this package of sending cluster bombs, and who are severely critical of the president for doing so. If he's doing it to scare the Russians, my fear is that sending cluster bombs will have the same impact that bombing of Dresden did in 1945, prolonging the enemy's resolve and prolonging the war. I can't see Russians folding because the United States has arranged for the Ukrainians to send these awful or have these awful anti-personnel weapons. Finally, on the personal side, what bothers me is I read Maureen Dowd's piece in the New York Times about the seventh grandchild. The Bidens, love to brag, as all grandparents do, about their grandchildren, how important family is. But there is a seventh grandchild, the child of love child of Hunter Biden and a woman in Arkansas, that not only do the Bidens refuse to acknowledge, but also refuse to help and refuse to even acknowledge the existence of that little girl. Is 4 years old now. And I think particularly damaging for me because Biden has cultivated the image of family all the time, of being a father first and foremost, and a grandfather first and foremost. And it's hypocritical, to put it in a word. And so these are reasons why I'm thinking that, plus obviously his anemic polling numbers, suggesting that he may have to rethink his candidacy.
Yeah, I mean, what's hypocritical? First of all, and look, this is something we have to keep doing, but I think I've done a pretty good job to remove my personal feelings from any like of any candidate. Maybe that's easy because by and large I don't like a lot of candidates, but when we get into talking about who we like, the reality is we don't know these people. We don't really know the Trumps. We don't really know the Bidens. We don't know the Harrises. We don't know the Clintons and all of these families. But what we do know, looking at the media, is during certain times, certain periods, a family is loved, a family is liked, and then probably for political reasons, then they are turned on, and the journalists, start to offer alternative viewpoints. The Bidens 1 year or over a year ago were loved; they were defended. You couldn't say anything wrong about them. Anytime a critic tried to say something wrong about the Biden family, it was a conspiracy theory. It was just MAGA this and MAGA that. And lo and behold, here we are, and the Biden family is being attacked. And so, I mean, what does that say about, first of all, what does it say about us as voters and our preference for some families that we don't really know? And even bigger, what does it say about journalism? What does it say about journalism when it is to their advantage to uphold a family, and then all of a sudden, when they determine for political reasons, it's time to boot them out? Yeah, I think in the grand scheme, it's just a larger it's a larger portrayal or reason to believe that our state of journalism is, well, let's be precise, objective journalism, real journalism, is non-existent. It's just as petty as anything else in politics. So that's on that side. I mean, on the cluster bomb side, I think you've nailed it. Look, I've been trying to, over the last year and a half since the war in Ukraine broke out, I've tried to present an alternative viewpoint on the war. And the thing that's very troubling to me is that you just can't find that in the mainstream media, pretty much whether it's right or left. There's basically one narrative, and it's the narrative that we need to support Ukraine at all costs, even if it gets us closer to World War III. And I just, for all this time, for a year and a half, it just really boggles my mind that there has been almost zero curiosity among a lot of pundits and among a lot of influencers to explore what is another side to this war. What is really going on? Why are we provoking more and more and more? I mean, at what point do we cross the line and the nuclear bombs start flying? I mean, we've been talking about it for a while, and we have to revisit that question. And so when you talk about cluster bombs, my question is is that the line in the sand? I mean, how does Putin and his regime react to that? I mean, it's so I'm glad we're talking about it. I'm glad we're exploring. Maybe this is a signal that the public is finally willing to look at another side of this, because for too long it's been eerily similar to Saddam Hussein, to Bin Laden, to Gaddafi. You know, this is almost a formula that when I shouldn't say when the neocons, when Washington D.C. has it out for a country, they vilify the nation, they vilify the leader, and they pretty much openly talk about regime change. And we've seen how that's worked over the last several years. And that's the same thing that's going on. That is the real reason behind this war. It's to topple Russia. Do we really want to topple Russia? Do we want to bring cluster bombs into this? Do we want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars more? Do we want more Ukrainian teenagers and young adults dying? Do we want more Russians dying? I think those are the questions that we really need to be focusing on. And maybe we're reaching that point.
Eloquently put. This is particularly troubling because cluster bombs are anti-personnel. They're not strategic weapons. They're not weapons for positioning. They are weapons that kill people. They don't do any harm to foliage or trees or buildings and so on. They're meant to kill people, and because of their reach and their design, they're meant to kill lots of people, and that means civilians. So you raise some questions. Is the very act of sending these cluster bombs a message to the Russians that it's time to get serious about negotiations, otherwise they'll be deployed? Is the real motive, as you point out, to get the Russians so demoralized that they revolt against Putin, or Putin is embarrassed to the point where he needs to step down? Or is this a purely aggressive act on the part of Ukraine to not only win back its eastern territories, but maybe even to cross into the border of Russia and destabilize the Russian government? None of those are very pleasant scenarios as far as I can see. The negotiations, but it seems as if we don't have to go this far to win negotiations. I still worry about the Dresden effect that I outlined a few minutes ago.
Well, I think
backfiring.
I think a more likely scenario is desperation, because we have been fed this narrative. And look, none of us know the truth. We have no idea about the truth of what's really going on there. Is there a war? Of course there's a war. But who's winning? We've been pumped all of this news that the Russians are demoralized and the Russian people hate Putin and they want. I personally don't believe that for 1 second. If you just take one history class in Russian history, when has there ever been a situation other than the Bolshevik Revolution, which was heavily funded from the outside, by the way, where a government was toppled from within? But as I alluded to, a lot of that came from finance from outside sources. I don't think that the Russians are ready to revolt against Putin. I don't think that the Ukrainians are just this close from winning. I think that we have spent an ungodly amount of money on that war and have contributed to the destruction of a nation, and clearly are trying to contribute to the destruction of another nation. In other words, this is quintessential empire. It's empire at its finest, although it's not so fine. And this to me tells me whatever NATO has been doing isn't working. So now they have to up the ante. And what happens when that doesn't work? Then we have to up the ante again. And what point do we reach where this whole thing spirals out of control? The United States does not have a good reputation and a good scorecard of fighting proxy wars and engaging in invasions and regime change. And to me, this all fits in that context. This is not a humanitarian war. This is a war of empire. And I think that those who have a lot of interest in this, coming from the United States and NATO, they're getting incredibly desperate, and they're upping the ante, and they're playing with fire.
I'm going to let that be the last word, because we used to start and finish these things in total disagreement, but we're in agreement today on both topics. Don't forget about the Kamala discussion. And so what I'd like to do now is just issue a plea that there are many of you that are following us and engaging in this podcast on a weekly basis. Please share these. Let's get some more subscribers and some more viewers and listeners. That's what will keep this conversation going. We'd also, of course, like to hear from you as well with your comments. Please feel free to agree, and please feel equally free to disagree. That's all for me. Jared?
Oh, well, we got so into this discussion, we forgot to mention the fact that we have new data. We did some polling last week, so I think we're out of time, but we'll be talking about this data. If you haven't, if you're on Twitter and you're not following us, our Twitter handle is @Zogby Strategies, and so I will be releasing data points over the next week, and we have some very interesting questions on topics that are popular, but the way that we word it is the Zogby way, which is the way that no other polling firm does. We really like to get at the heart and soul of the people with our special kind of questions, and you can get that by following us on Twitter @Zogby Strategies.
Great, thanks. Have a good week. We'll be back in a few days, though, with that data.
Sure.
Take care.
Have a good one.
Bye.